Hello and welcome to the JSA Studio. I am your host, as always, Nathan, and today I'm coming at you with another Big Ten breakdown, this time for Week 8 of the season. But before we get into that, I am going to go ahead and ask you to like, comment, and subscribe. It would really help out the channel if you did. And now, with the intro done and out of the way, there's only one thing left to do, and that is to get by starting with the treading water tier. These are teams whose opinion I have of them was not changed based off of their play this week. That is what it means to tread water, and that is why they are in the treading water tier. So obviously you have the four teams that were on a bye this week: Washington, Penn State, Minnesota, and Ohio State. And then you have Wisconsin and Northwestern, who played each other, and that game went just about how I expected it to go. I expected Wisconsin to win relatively easily, and they did. They won relatively easily. When you look at a team like Washington coming out of the bye this week, when you look at a team like Penn State, as well as Ohio State, both timely buys for those teams. Ohio State gets a get-right week after losing to Oregon. They're going to come out and ass blast Nebraska off the map this week. Penn State is going to go ahead and play this Wisconsin team that is also on here this week as well. And that is a sneaky tough game. It is on the road for Penn State. Could very well be looking ahead to Ohio State. Could be a statement sort of program building win for Luke Fickell at Wisconsin. They have been playing significantly better the past few weeks, really since that first half against USC. So that's a tough football game. Don't want to get too much into talking about the breakdowns here, but it was a timely buy for Penn State and Ohio State as they can kind of handle business this week and then look forward to their matchup. That was the main point I wanted to make. Next tier is a very deep Scarlett Johansson tier. Why is it called the Scarlett Johansson tier? Well, because these teams look pretty. That's why it's called the Scarlett Johansson tier. We'll go ahead and start with Oregon. I honestly thought they might struggle a little bit against this game. I thought Purdue looked significantly better against Illinois the previous week. I thought the change at quarterback invoked some life into that program, and it might have. We don't particularly know. However, even on the short week there, Oregon went in and proved why they are currently ranked the number one team in the country. They are a real and legitimate national title contender. They should end the season undefeated. Washington is really the only game left on their schedule that I think they might have trouble with. That is a rivalry game. However, it is at home, and after they lost twice last year, I think there's a definitive possibility that Oregon is just going to go ahead and handle business in that game, especially because of how the two games went last year, the fact that they lost close games as well. And we'll stay on the top row, go to the middle now. Maryland beat USC by 1 point in a game that I thought USC was going to be able to handle. And this loss specifically opens up some questions about USC and the program and where they are. And also whether or not Lincoln Riley is actually going to be the guy to turn this team into something that it hasn't been since the early 2000s, which is a consistent title contender in their conference. They have not been that for a very long time. The vast majority of my life at this point, they have not been that. And there does have to be some serious questions about USC and where that program is going. We'll get more into that in the last segment of this video. Turning to Maryland, if you look at this, all of a sudden, Maryland is 4-3 with a game against Minnesota this week that they very well could win, and a game against Rutgers that you look at it and the way Rutgers are playing right now, that you also probably should win that game. Iowa at home is not an unwinnable game either. This is all of a sudden a team that has a little bit of give when it comes to making a bowl game. Now, I'm not sure making a bowl game will save Lockley's position as head coach. However, it certainly will help. If they can, in my opinion, upset Minnesota this week, all of a sudden they just need to handle business against Rutgers, and maybe they, can beat Iowa as well. They're not a good football team. They're just not. I've been telling you that this whole year when it comes to Iowa, okay? But if they win a bowl game, there's a solid chance that they can keep the program together. And I said win a bowl game, not make a bowl game. They do have a good chance to make a bowl game this year, but they got to win the game in order for me to feel confident in the direction of this football team. And even then, I'm probably not going to be overly confident that they can be anything more than 6-6 or 7-5 every year. However, maybe if they can hit on the right couple of recruits here or there, get some guys, which Locksley has done during his career. He has found players like that as a head coach and as a offensive coordinator. So there is perhaps a glimmer of hope with this football team right now. Moving on to Indiana, you guys are one of the 10 best teams in college football. And that is crazy to say. And I've said this before a couple of times. That's actually insane to talk about. Indiana, in my entire lifetime, has never been anything other than like a check mark game as a Michigan fan. It's like, oh yeah, we're going to win that game. And then you move on. This year, they're going to make what you did to Nebraska look like Nebraska put up a fight to Michigan. Okay? That's the reality of that game. And you've got a shot against Ohio State. More so than I think probably anyone else on their schedule, including Penn State. Penn State, they just have this thing with Ohio State where they play the game and they lose. Sometimes it's close, most of the time it's not. But as long as James Franklin is their head coach, I'm never going to predict them to beat Ohio State. But that is, again, a problem for next week, 2 Fridays from now. Indiana, you are a real football team. I don't know if the Florida job opens up, if you will be able to keep Curt Cignetti there. I think there's a very, very, very real possibility that if Lane Kiffin says no, Florida's next guy on their list is going to be Curt Cignetti, and you do not have the ability to keep him there if Florida comes a-calling. Florida is one of, I would say, probably the 15 to 20 or so jobs in this country that a mid-tier football program like Indiana is just never going to be able to keep their coach if they do find the guy. It's just a reality at this point. They're not in that little middle tier where there's only really 3 or 4 jobs that you would leave for. That's like Washington, for example. Kalen DeBoer leaving for Alabama. Like Alabama, Georgia, Texas, and Ohio State, maybe Oklahoma are like the only jobs that you would leave Washington for, because that's a place where you can win consistently. Michigan State is also in that tier, who we'll talk about in a moment, as well as a few other teams where they're not a destination, but they're too good of a job to leave unless it's a truly and genuine elite caliber job, and there are probably only 4 or 5 of those in college football. Now, there's a very real possibility, if you can negotiate the contract right now, that you double his salary or whatever, and you say, hey, stick around for a few years. There's a real possibility that Indiana could turn into that kind of program where you're winning 9 to 11 games every year and occasionally making it to the Big Ten championship game and even winning it sometimes. I don't think that's an impossibility. Now, One thing I will say is that it is going to be very hard to replicate the success that you were having this year next year. Because your team is so transfer heavy, it's going to be very, very hard for you to replicate what you're doing this year next year. Now, I still believe in Kurt Signetti. However, if you get him through this year, I don't think he's going to be a hot coaching candidate next season, because I believe this team is going to take a step back. However, I still believe Kurt Signetti is going to be able to recruit well enough, and that his pitch is going to be convincing enough to get a lot of players who never would have looked at Indiana otherwise at Indiana. You do have a relatively big fan base. The NIL is something that is going to have to improve if you're going to really take that next step. However, you have the fan base and the alumni to improve in the NIL game. Either way, if you can keep Kurt Signetti after this season, which will become a significantly harder task if the Michigan job opens up. However, and by the way, I'm not saying Kurt Signetti is going to go to Michigan. I don't know if Kurt Signetti is going to go to Michigan. I'm just saying that 2 top-tier jobs in Michigan and Florida opening up in the same season is going to have a, effect down the line, because they might take from mid-tier schools and the mid-tier schools are going to take from smaller schools, et cetera, et cetera. And that could increase the probability that Kurt Signetti gets poached by another team. However, the main point I want to make is I believe he is the right guy. I think he's a brilliant fit for Indiana, and I think you should pay him whatever the fuck he asks for, even if that's north of $10 million a year. And then you just ride out next year, and then all of a sudden you get your recruiting going and you get the development going, and then now you're an actual consistent football program in year 3, 4, 5, where you could be looking at double-digit wins every season, and then that becomes the expectation, and then you can take the next step after that. That is all, in reality, something that can happen for this team, which is not something I would have said before this year. Anyway, that was a long-ass Indiana segment of this video here. I'm going to move on to Michigan State. Actually, I lied. Let's do UCLA. UCLA, you won a game. I'm happy for you. You won a game. You have improved the past few weeks. I think you maybe are now a little bit more confident heading into year 2 with your new head coach. And I think you have a reasonable expectation to make a bowl game next year now. And you're not going to make one this year, but that is a relatively okay proof of concept that you now actually have. The team has gotten better basically every week. If you can win another game or 2, it is going to help the process. And then you head into year 2, and it's like, okay, now we're going to find out a little bit more. Outside of that, I don't have a lot to say, which is why I went through UCLA first. Going back to Michigan State, what I saw in this game against Iowa was Adrian Chiles becoming that guy. He looks so much better than he did before the bye. The bye was exactly what he needed. This is someone that I believe heading into next year very well could be in the first round draft pick conversation. Well, he probably will be in the first round draft pick conversation, but less that. More, he will be maybe the best quarterback in the Big Ten. Now, obviously, there could be transfers and things like that, and we don't know. However, I will tell you right now, I have more confidence that Adrian Chiles is going to be elite next year than I do in Dylan Raiola. Okay? And Dylan Raiola, I am pretty confident is going to turn into an elite quarterback at some point. It might not be next year. It might be year 3. However, next year, I think there's a very, very, very real possibility Michigan State could end up being one of the 3 best teams in the Big Ten. Now, all of that could change with a loss this week. Now, we'll talk about that on Friday. Okay, I get it. But if you win this week, which I've been honest with you throughout the season, I think you're going to win. Okay, it's not a surprise. I've been saying that for weeks. Now you're sitting at 5-3, and you're going to make a bowl game at that point, which is another 3 or 4 or potentially even 5 weeks of practice that you get to have with Childs. And this is going to help your program tremendously going forward. Now, is the season over if you lose to Michigan? No, it's a rivalry game. Weird shit happens, okay? You still would then have Purdue and Rutgers to end the season. You should, in my opinion, win both of those games, and that'll get you to a bowl game anyway. However, there is a difference between 6-6 and 7-5. And the main difference is if you win the bowl game, 8-5 looks so much better than 7-6. If you go 8-5 in a year where the vast majority of people, myself included, did not think you were going to get past 5 wins, that signals that you're already ahead of the rebuild. And when you look at this team, you're honestly not losing a whole lot next year. You're going to have to find a running back to replace Nate Carter. That's a real issue. However, Nate Carter isn't an insurmountable piece to replace or potentially even get better at. So I'm not all that concerned there. And that's probably maybe the biggest piece you're going to lose this year. So this is a team that has a very, very bright future, potentially even as soon as next season. Moving on to what will hopefully be a much quicker segment here. This is the all right tier, and that has 2 meanings. With Purdue, it means I don't know what the fuck I expected of you. Of course this happens. This is, I think, the second time this season where I've believed in Purdue, and they've fucking let me down like nothing I've ever seen. Never again. You are not going to be predicted to win a single game the rest of the season. It's not going to happen. Illinois, I knew I should have picked you. I've been saying for weeks you're a better football team than Michigan. I've been saying for weeks you should be favored. But my fandom might have gotten a little bit better of me. I thought there's a very real possibility that Michigan might just come out and get something in the passing game. And that didn't happen. Michigan is horrible, and we'll talk about them a little bit here. I talked about them on Monday. So if you're interested in that, then you can go ahead and look for that video that I did on Monday about Michigan. I titled that video Doing Less with More, because that's what this team is doing. This team has multiple first-round picks on defense, potentially as many as 5 first-round picks, probably 4 this year, and then there are several players that I think could end up being in that first-round conversation after they transfer and get some actual coaching next season somewhere the fuck else. All that being said, I don't need to be talking about Michigan right now. I'm here to talk about Illinois. You handled business. That's a big, big win for you. You're going to have an opportunity to play Oregon this week. Now, you're going to be traveling 3 time zones, so it's not ideal. However, it is still an opportunity to play that game. And after that, you have 4 games that you quite honestly should just win. Michigan State's a little concerning. However, I do think at home that makes a difference. Rutgers on the road, I just don't think Rutgers can beat you. Northwestern on the road, maybe a little bit tighter than Rutgers, but I still think you should win that game. Minnesota, 2 games from now, slightly concerning as well, but again, I think being at home helps you, and I think those are games that you should win. So there's a real possibility that you're staring down the barrel of 10-2. That's not going to be good enough to get you to the playoffs. However, you could get a pretty good bowl game with an opportunity to play another ranked team and really set your program forward to get to that 11-win mark. Next tier, 3 teams in it. This is the ass tier, because that's what these teams are. They are ass. Or at least this past week, they played like ass.
I don't want to hear any more about Obi-Wan. The Jedi turned against me. Don't you turn against me?
I don't know you anymore. Anakin, you're breaking my heart. You're going down a path I can't follow.
Go ahead and call me Padme, because Rutgers, you're breaking my heart, man. I wholeheartedly believed that you were going to be a competent football team this year, that you were going to make a bowl game. But I can't keep predicting you to win when you keep losing every week in a more and more convincing fashion. You're on the road this week, and as much as I would love to see you beat USC and likely put an end to the Lincoln Riley tenure as the head coach of USC, I just don't think it's going to happen. I gotta believe that USC is gonna win that game because you've just disappointed me each of the past few weeks. I thought you had a real shot to beat Wisconsin. I thought that was going to be a close game. It wasn't. You should have beaten UCLA. UCLA traveled across the goddamn country. You had no business losing that game. They're horrible. By no metric are they a better football team than you. And you still lost. It is now very, very hard to see a pathway for you to get to a bowl game. I'm not even sure you win another game this year. And it makes me sad because I wanted so desperately for this team to be at least okay. And it's just not going to happen. Moving on relatively quickly to Nebraska. Remember, this ain't your year. Next year is your year. Your job this season is to get bowl eligible. You've got a very good chance to do that. It won't be this week against Ohio State, but I think you should still end up with 7 or 8 wins this year fairly easily. You should beat UCLA 2 weeks from now. You should beat USC. Wisconsin will be a dogfight, but that's at home. And Iowa at Iowa to end the year. You know, Iowa's a tough place to play. It'll probably be a night game. I don't know. But I think you're a better football team than Iowa. And that, of course, leads me into talking about Iowa themselves. I told you, you are not a good football team. You're just not. You might make a bowl game, you might not. To be honest with you, I don't know. Northwestern's a solid football team. They might get you. Wisconsin, I think, is a better team than you. Now, you should beat UCLA, and to be honest with you, you probably should beat Maryland, and that gets you to a bowl game. However, it wouldn't shock me if Maryland upset you. I don't think you're that far apart. Now, I think you're probably going to be able to run the ball against Maryland, and that's likely the difference. However, I don't think you're going to beat Nebraska, and I don't think you're going to beat Wisconsin, and Northwestern's probably a 50-50 game. So best case scenario is 7-5, and that's not very good. You're just not a good football team this year. The defense has taken a tremendous step backwards from the past few seasons, and you still don't have a quarterback worth of shit. Cade McNamara is horrible. He was horrible at Michigan, but Michigan had such a dominant run game that teams just did not give a fuck about defending the pass. And that's why he actually looked kind of decent. But the second Michigan actually started asking him to be a quarterback and do quarterback things, he sucked. He was horrible in his one start in 2022. And yeah, he got hurt. He easily could have came back, I think, during that season. But he didn't because he wanted to preserve the year as a red shirt so he could get the extra year to transfer and go somewhere else. And somehow you guys got suckered into making him your starting quarterback. And yeah, I don't think this is a good football team. I think best case scenario, you're 7-5. I think 6-6 is wholly realistic, and 5-7 isn't out of the conversation. Moving on to the final tier before we get into the rankings for this video here, we have the super ass tier, because even though those other teams are ass, these teams are super ass. USC and Michigan, both in the same boat. Wildly disappointing seasons. Now, I will say I jumped off the Michigan ship a little bit sooner than everybody else. However, I stayed on with USC a little bit more than everybody else did. So I think it kind of balances out to being neutral on these two teams. I did not see either of these teams being as bad as they are. USC's win over LSU looks more and more insane as the week goes on. There's a very, very real chance that LSU is playing in the SEC championship game. If they beat Texas A&M this week, they honestly should cruise, relatively speaking, to that championship game. I mean, they play Texas A&M this week. I think they probably should win that game, even though it is on the road and it is a night game. They bring Alabama at home. I think LSU might just be a better football team than Alabama. It is still kind of a rivalry game. I think Brian Kelly is going to want to make a statement in that game, and I think they are a better coached team with similar levels of talent. So I think USC should be favored in that game outright. Florida, as long as they, don't have a letdown from the Alabama game, should be able to handle Florida, should be able to beat Vanderbilt, who has no business being ranked, and they should destroy Oklahoma to end the season. So there's a very real possibility if they can get through these next two games that they will go undefeated in SEC play, and USC is a very, very, very bad football team. Just genuinely, just a bad football team. Moving on from USC, I have Michigan. I made a almost 40-minute long video about Michigan on Monday. You can watch that if you want more in-depth thoughts. The only thing I'm going to say about Michigan is that they did get a 5-star offensive tackle and I think number 10 recruit in the country to commit to their team. And there have been rumors of flying about Bryce Underwood. And my only thought about Bryce Underwood coming to Michigan is, if you want Bryce Underwood to come to Michigan, why don't you fire Sharon Moore and bring in Brian Kelly? That's what I would say. Now, is that entirely unrealistic? No. Is it likely to happen? No. I don't particularly see any scenario where Sharon Moore is only given one season by this Michigan institution at a program level. I believe that the program probably thinks that if they only give Sharon Moore a year, it's going to be hell to convince another coach to come here. I don't think firing him if he goes 4-8 or 5-7 is going to affect how the next coach views this job. Okay? Because I would have a lot more leeway if this was a Brian Kelly type of coach and it was 5-7. It's like, oh, okay, you whiffed on the quarterback with it. It's okay. Everything happens. It's whatever. We'll come back next year. This is a proven winner at the coaching position. This doesn't matter. But this is not the case with Sharon Moore. We cannot assume it's going to be better next year. However, if Dave Portnoy can pay Bryce Underwood enough money to come to the University of Michigan, yeah, sure, give Sharon Moore another fucking year. Cool. I'm fine with it. It's whatever. Now, first off, I don't particularly think Michigan's going to keep a lot of their big-time recruits that they have committed to this team. There are already rumors about Ivan Taylor flipping to Alabama. I think that's incredibly likely to happen. He flipped from Notre Dame to Michigan. This is very clearly not someone that has a lot of loyalty to his word, so to speak, and I don't expect him to. He's fucking 17 or whatever the fuck. And he's got to do what he's got to do to set up himself and his family in terms of money and potentially making it to the NFL. So I don't particularly care if he decommits. It doesn't bother me when players do that because they're doing what's best for themselves, or at least what they believe is best for themselves. And I do not fault them for that. However, I think there's a very, very real possibility if Michigan loses out, which is a real possibility, or if Michigan only beats Northwestern, or only beats Michigan State, or even if they go 6-6 and somehow luck into a bowl game. I firmly believe that they're going to see a mass exodus of transfers this year, and the recruiting is likely not going to be good enough to make up for that. So I just don't really see any positives coming out of this situation here. And if you're worried about Babola decommitting because Sharon Moore is gone, I don't care. Genuinely, I don't care. 1 5-star offensive tackle is not going to change the trajectory of this program. Now, if it was Bryce Underwood, yes, that can change the trajectory of your program. We saw it with J.J. McCarthy. Okay? But that's not the case. It's just not. I don't think Bryce Underwood is going to commit to Michigan. I think it's very, very unlikely that he commits to Michigan. I don't think it's unlikely that he flips his commitment from LSU to somewhere else or decommits from LSU. Because I think there's a very real possibility that Garrett Nussmeier returns next season. He has another year of eligibility. And he probably wants to play right away. He does not strike me as the kind of kid that's going to want to sit behind another quarterback, even though it almost always works out. If you're a big-time recruit and they've got a guy who's already an established player, it almost always works out to sit behind that guy. Like, genuinely, it's just the truth of the matter. However, he does strike me as someone who is not going to want to sit behind another quarterback. All that being said, he's not fucking committing to Michigan if he decommits to LSU. There's a very small possibility that that happens. I think he would look at Auburn. I think he would look at Ole Miss if Lane Kiffin is still there. I think he would look at Colorado, potentially, or USC if Lincoln Riley is still there. Those are all teams that have much better shots of getting Bryce Underwood to commit to them than Michigan does. It's a fact of reality. I don't care if you disagree with me. You are wrong. I am right. I am not generally the type of person to have hard lines like that, but this is one of the situations where I have genuinely thought about this a lot, and I do not think there is any way reasonable person can come to the conclusion different than the conclusion I've come to. All in all, I think it's still probably like a 75% chance he just stays at LSU, and I think that if in that 25% chance he does flip his commitment or decommits from LSU, I would give Michigan a less than 1% of that 25% chance in order to actually get him to commit to Michigan. I don't care that Dave Portnoy is going to offer him $4 million. He can get similar money from other schools. Auburn can come in and offer him $2.5, $3 million. It's a very realistic thing that can happen. He can go to Colorado and get the exposure with Deion Sanders and have a decent shot to win early on in his career. He can go to USC and get all that LA money with the opportunity to do commercials and shit like that. It's just not something that's going to happen for him to come to Michigan. It's very, very unlikely. The only real scenario I could see him coming to Michigan is if we go out and poach Brian Kelly from LSU, which is not impossible, but is very unlikely in my opinion. Circling back to Sharon Moore now, genuinely, the only way I think he should come back this year, or next year rather, is if he does get that less than 1% chance and gets Bryce Underwood to commit to this team. That's the only way I want to see Sharon Moore back next year. That's it. That is the only scenario. All right, last things last, and that is the rankings. We're going to go ahead and start off with the power rankings of the Big Ten. Number 1, I have Oregon. Number 2, Ohio State. Number 3, Penn State. Number 4, Indiana. That remains unchanged from last week. Illinois is up 1 spot to number 5. Wisconsin up 1 spot to number 6 as they are turning into the team that I thought they might be at the beginning of the year. Nebraska falls from 5 to 7. They are down 2 spots. Minnesota and Washington move up 3 spots each, largely because everybody else that played this week played like shit. They didn't win or do anything this week. They had byes. However, everybody else looked like ass, so they move up. Michigan State up 4 spots after beating Iowa. USC down 2 spots after losing to Maryland. If they didn't have the travel, I still think they probably win that game. Iowa down 4 spots. Rutgers down 3 spots. Michigan down 1 spot. Northwestern stays the same. Maryland and UCLA both jump one spot as they have surprising victories. And Purdue, the new worst team in the Big Ten by my rankings, all the way down at 18. That's the first time this year that UCLA has not been the worst team in the Big Ten. Moving on to my personal rankings for the top 15. Oregon is up one spot to number 1. They are currently my number 1 team in the country. They have a relatively easy path to 12-0 and what is looking like a rematch for Ohio State in the Big Ten championship game, unless Indiana can pull off the upset. At number 2, I have Georgia jumping Ohio State, who remains the same at number 3. I have Penn State at number 4. Texas falls all the way down to 5. I'm not going to fault them that much for losing to a very, very good Georgia team who kind of had the pride of their program on the line in this game. Notre Dame, who I am significantly higher on than the AP poll, they are at number 6. They keep winning. They keep dominating. Yes, they lost to Northern Illinois. Cool. I don't give a shit. They're going to end the season 11-1, and they're going to make the playoffs. LSU, who I am also higher on than the AP poll, they move up one spot for me to number 7. I have Clemson up one spot to the number 8 position. I have Tennessee up 2 spots to the number 9 position after beating Alabama for the second time in 3 years. Iowa State stays pat at number 10 after winning a close game. Miami up 1 spot to number 11. BYU now up 1 spot to number 12. I have Indiana up another 1 spot to number 13. And Boise State now jumps to number 14 as there is no Alabama in my top 15 because I wanted to recognize the currently undefeated and potential ACC championship game bound Pittsburgh Panthers, who were not ranked last week. They are number 15 in this poll, and the G5 pick, if not Boise State, is going to be Army, in my opinion. I think Army is better than Navy. I do think it is close, and I think Army might be the second best Group of 5 team in the country this season. However, that's just me, and what do I know? I'm just some asshole on the internet giving you his opinion. It's at this point I would like to remind you to like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you want to see more Big Ten focused content, and if you disagree at any point, go ahead and drop a comment down in the comment section below. And now with the outro done and out of the way, there's only one thing left to say, and that's that I'll see you next time.